The mess hall aboard the Zinnereth, the flagship of the Galactic Vanguard, was a cacophony of alien voices. Soldiers from dozens of species crowded around long tables, their voices blending into a mix of clicks, growls, hums, and deep resonances. Stories of bravery and cunning were traded freely, a bonding ritual among the warriors of the galaxy. But even among the most hardened soldiers, one name carried an almost mythic weight: Commander Threl Vintha, the veteran of the Kharkiv Rebellion and the Siege of Andoran. Threl was a Krelnith, a towering reptilian species known for their impenetrable scales and ruthless combat instincts. His mere presence in the hall silenced the din as warriors craned their necks to catch a glimpse of the legend. He moved with a measured grace, his deep-set eyes scanning the room. Slung across his back was a ceremonial blade, its edge jagged from decades of use. He chose a table near the center of the room, seating himself among a group of younger soldiers who watched him with a mix of awe and apprehension. One of them, a lanky Zaltrian with iridescent skin, spoke up, his voice quivering. "Commander Threl, is it true you held the Kharkiv line for 7 cycles without reinforcements?" Threl gave a low, rumbling chuckle, his teeth glinting in the dim light. 7 cycles? No, it was 9. But that's not the most interesting part of the story. Before he could continue, another soldier, a burly Thashan with bioluminescent markings, leaned forward. "Forget the Kharkiv line. Tell us about Andoran. They say you single-handedly breached the fortress gates." Threl raised a clawed hand, silencing the eager interruptions. "I could tell you about those battles," he said, his voice like distant thunder. "But I have stories far more chilling than anything the Kharkiv or the Endurii could muster. Stories from a species most of you think of as primitive." The soldiers exchanged puzzled glances. "What species?" the Zaltrian asked. Threl leaned forward, his gaze sweeping across the table. "Humans," he said. The name sent a ripple through the group. Most of them had only heard of humans in passing. A fledgling species from a small, unremarkable planet on the galactic outskirts. They were known more for their chaotic politics and fragile biology than any significant military achievements. "Humans?" the Thashan snorted. "What could they possibly have to offer? They're barely out of their gravity well." Threl's eyes narrowed. "Do not mistake their lack of advancement for weakness," he said. "Humans are different. And if you underestimate them, you won't live long enough to regret it." The table fell silent, the younger soldiers leaning in as Threl began his tale. "It was during the Siege of Andoran that I first encountered humans," Threl said. "They weren't part of the main assault force. At least not officially. They were mercenaries, volunteers from a planet that had no stake in our war. I remember looking at them and thinking they were laughably underprepared. No natural armor, no advanced weapons. Just flimsy exosuits and projectile rifles. But there was something in their eyes, something unsettling." He paused, his gaze distant. "The first night we took heavy casualties. The Endurii were relentless, their artillery raining down on us without pause. Many of our soldiers broke ranks, retreating to the trenches. But not the humans. They stayed on the front lines even as the sky burned around them. At first I thought it was ignorance. Maybe they didn't understand how outmatched they were. But then I saw how they fought." Threl's claws tapped against the table, a slow rhythmic sound that sent a shiver through his listeners. "Humans have a way of turning desperation into a weapon. I watched them charge headlong into enemy fire, their faces set in grim determination. They didn't fight like soldiers. They fought like cornered predators, every move calculated to inflict maximum damage, even at the cost of their own lives." The Zaltrian shifted uncomfortably. "That sounds reckless." "It was," Threl agreed. "But it was also terrifying. The Endurii didn't know how to handle them. Their precision strikes and overwhelming firepower meant nothing against an enemy that refused to be cowed. And when the humans ran out of ammunition..." He paused, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "That's when things got truly horrifying." The Thashan frowned. "What do you mean?" Threl's gaze hardened. "They didn't retreat. They didn't surrender. They improvised. I saw one of them rip a shard of Endurii armor from the ground and use it as a makeshift blade. Another tore the power core from a fallen drone and hurled it like a grenade. They turned the battlefield into a slaughterhouse, and they did it with whatever they could find." He leaned back, his expression grim. "But it wasn't just their resourcefulness that shook me. It was the way they spoke to each other in the heat of battle. Humans have a peculiar sense of humor, even in the face of death. I remember one of them laughing as he threw a plasma charge, yelling something about making it rain. Another shouted to his squad mate, 'If I die, delete my search history.' I didn't understand the words at the time, but the tone was unmistakable. They were joking. Joking while surrounded by death. The table fell silent, the weight of Threll's words sinking in. Finally Mara, a quiet Virian with translucent skin, spoke up. What happened after the battle? We won, Threll said simply. But it wasn't because of our superior numbers or strategy. It was because the humans refused to lose. They fought until the Endurii were too terrified to stand their ground. And when the smoke cleared, the humans didn't celebrate. They didn't boast. They simply gathered their dead and moved on. He looked around the table, his gaze piercing. That was the moment I realized something important. Humans don't fight for glory or conquest. They fight for each other. For the person standing next to them. And that makes them far more dangerous than any species I've ever encountered. The soldiers sat in stunned silence, the air heavy with the weight of Threll's story. Finally the Thascian spoke, his voice hesitant. Are all humans like that? Threll gave a low rumbling chuckle. Not all. But enough. And if you ever find yourself facing them on the battlefield, remember this. They are fragile, yes. But fragility breeds resilience. Underestimate them and you won't live to regret it. As he stood to leave, the soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. The legend of Threll Vintha had grown, but now it was intertwined with a new, unsettling truth, one that would linger in their minds long after the mess hall had emptied. The humans were coming. And the galaxy would never be the same. The next day the mess hall was packed even earlier than usual. Word of Commander Threll Vintha's human stories had spread like wildfire, and soldiers from every corner of the ship had crowded into the room, eager to hear more. Despite the influx of warriors, a respectful hush fell over the hall as Threll entered, his imposing figure drawing every gaze. He returned to the same table as the day before, the group of younger soldiers waiting in rapt anticipation. The Thascian from the previous night, who had scoffed at humans, now leaned forward eagerly. The others too looked less skeptical and more intrigued. Back for more, I see, Threll said, his deep voice resonating. Of course, Commander, the Zaltrian said, his bioluminescent skin shifting to a shade of excited green. You promised more stories about humans and none of us can stop thinking about them. Threll's lips curled into a faint smile, but it was tinged with something somber. Very well. If you think you're ready to hear the truth of what humans are capable of, then listen closely. This next story, he paused, letting the tension hang in the air. This one has haunted me for years. It was during the Orksoth campaign, Threll began, his voice low and steady. A brutal war fought across the moons of the Jarlock system. The Orksoth were relentless. A hive species with swarming tactics that could overwhelm entire fleets. Our forces were stretched thin and morale was dangerously low. Then, out of nowhere, we received reinforcements, an entire human battalion fresh from Earth. They arrived in these ramshackle transport ships, barely held together by welding and hope, he said, shaking his head. When they disembarked, they didn't look like soldiers. Their armor was mismatched, their weapons a patchwork of outdated tech. They didn't march in formation or salute like we did. They were informal. Disorganized. The Thascian snorted. And yet they made a difference? Threll fixed him with a piercing stare. Oh yes, a very big difference. But not in the way you'd expect. He leaned forward, his claws tapping lightly on the table. The humans weren't just fighters. They were storytellers. They called it gallows humor, a way to cope with the horrors of war. And as strange as it sounds, it worked. Threll's gaze became distant, his mind clearly reliving the events. One night, the Orksoth launched a surprise attack. Their drones swept through our encampment, tearing through defenses. Panic set in among the troops and even I, trained and experienced as I was, felt the cold grip of fear. But the humans? They didn't panic. They huddled together around a burning wreckage, laughing. Laughing, I thought they'd lost their minds. One of them, an officer they called Captain Holloway, stood up and shouted over the chaos, "You think this is bad? Try surviving rush hour in New York." The table erupted in confused murmurs, and the Zaltrian tilted his head. What does that mean? Threll chuckled darkly. I asked him the same thing after the battle. He explained that rush hour is a time when human cities are clogged with vehicles, and it's a nightmare to navigate. It made no sense to me at the time, but the way he said it, it broke the tension. The soldiers stopped panicking. They started firing back. Some of them even joined in the strange banter, shouting things like, "At least these bugs don't charge rent," or "I'd trade this fight for my ex-wife any day." The Virian soldier Mara frowned. How could that possibly help? Threll gestured with a claw, as if emphasizing an undeniable truth. Humans have a unique way of reframing fear. They mock it. They diminish its power by laughing in its face. And in that moment, their humor spread through the ranks like wildfire. Even our soldiers, who had no idea what they were talking about, found themselves emboldened. It was as if their courage was contagious. He paused, his voice dropping to a grave tone. But the humans' bravery came at a cost. After we repelled the attack, I found myself on the front lines again the next day, fighting beside Captain Holloway and his squad. The Orksoth threw everything they had at us. Waves upon waves of drones, followed by massive siege beasts. It was chaos. Threll's expression hardened. Holloway's squad took the brunt of the assault. One by one they fell, but not before taking down scores of enemies. Holloway himself was gravely injured, his exosuit shattered, his weapon destroyed. But even then he didn't stop. He grabbed an Orksoth drone by its spindly legs, using it as a club to fend off the others. The Zoltrian gasped. He fought with his bare hands? Yes, Threll said. And when he was finally overwhelmed, I heard his last words broadcast over the comms. He said, "Tell my mom I died doing what I loved, beating up aliens." The soldiers stared at him, stunned into silence. Finally the Thashin muttered, "That's insane." "It is," Threll agreed. "But that's what makes humans so dangerous. They fight as though they have nothing to lose, and they find meaning in the most absurd places. Even in death, they inspire those around them to keep fighting." The room was silent for a long moment, the weight of Threll's story pressing down on everyone. Finally Mara spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "What happened after the battle?" "We won," Threll said simply. "The Orksoth were driven back, their hive destroyed. But it wasn't because of our tactics or superior firepower. It was because of the humans. Their sacrifice gave us the time and morale we needed to rally. And their stories, those ridiculous, absurd stories, they stayed with us. They reminded us why we were fighting in the first place." He stood, his towering frame casting a shadow over the table. Humans may seem small, fragile, and insignificant. But their resilience, their ingenuity, and their ability to find strength in the darkest moments, that makes them the most dangerous species I've ever encountered. As Threll walked away, the soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. The legend of humans had grown even larger, and the thought of facing such a relentless, unpredictable foe left them deeply unsettled. The Zoltrian finally broke the silence, his voice tinged with awe. "If this is what humans are like when they're helping us, I'd hate to see what they're like when they're our enemies." The mess hall was buzzing with an almost electric tension the next evening, the largest crowd yet crammed into the space. Even soldiers who had dismissed humans as irrelevant curiosities were now desperate to hear more. The room was standing room only, the collective curiosity of dozens of alien species palpable. Threll Vintha, ever composed, strode in as if unaware of the growing audience, though the faint flick of his tail betrayed his amusement. He sat at the same table, the soldiers around him now silent in reverence. This time no one dared to interrupt with questions or doubts. They simply waited, hanging on his every word as he began the next tale. "I've spoken about humans as allies," Threll said, his deep voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "But now I'll tell you what it's like to face them as enemies." A sharp intake of breath rippled through the crowd. The soldiers at his table exchanged uneasy glances, the air suddenly heavier. "It was during the Skarnith offensive," Threll continued. "An operation to retake a mining colony on a moon that had been abandoned decades earlier. The colony was a strategic target, rich in rare minerals crucial for starship construction. But by the time we arrived, we found that someone else had already claimed it, a human-led resistance cell." Threll's claws tapped rhythmically on the table, a sound that seemed to echo in the silent room. "We didn't know much about the resistance at first. They operated in the shadows, striking supply lines and sabotaging our landing zones. At first we thought they were just a minor nuisance. But that changed the moment we encountered them in open combat." He leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "The first time we engaged them, we outnumbered them 10-1. Our forces were equipped with the finest plasma weaponry, shields, and combat drones. By all accounts, the humans should have been obliterated. And yet, they won. Not just once but repeatedly. They didn't rely on superior technology or firepower. Instead, they used tactics so unconventional that our strategists were baffled. They turned the environment itself into a weapon. They set traps in the tunnels beneath the colony, collapsing them to cut off our reinforcements. They used mining equipment to create improvised weapons, turning harmless tools into instruments of destruction. And their stealth, By the stars, their stealth was unparalleled. The Zoltrian soldier, his iridescent skin dimmed with unease, finally spoke. Were they using some kind of advanced cloaking tech? Threll shook his head. No. They used something far simpler, their understanding of fear. They struck at night when our soldiers were tired and vulnerable. They exploited the psychological cracks in our ranks, planting false signals and eerie recordings that made us think we were surrounded. And when they finally attacked, they came from every direction at once. The Virian soldier Mara frowned. But how could they win with such limited resources? Threll's gaze hardened. Because humans don't fight wars the way other species do. For them, war isn't just a contest of strength or strategy. It's personal. Every human in that resistance cell fought as if the survival of their entire species depended on it. And in a way it did. They fought not just for victory but for revenge, for their families, for the memories of those they'd lost. That kind of determination is unstoppable. He paused, his voice dropping. I remember one human in particular. They called her Commander Reyes. She was their leader, a tactician so brilliant that she turned every disadvantage into an opportunity. We captured one of her soldiers once, a young man barely out of training. He was terrified, shaking as we questioned him. But when we asked about Reyes, his eyes lit up with something I can only describe as devotion. You'll never beat her, he told us. She's seen worse than you. She's survived worse than you. And she'll make sure you pay for what you've done. Threll's claws dug into the table as he spoke, the memory clearly weighing on him. That soldier wasn't lying. Reyes didn't just outmaneuver us, she made us fear her. Every time we thought we had her cornered, she slipped through our grasp. Every time we thought we had the upper hand, she turned it against us. The Thascian soldier, now far less dismissive of humans than he had been, leaned forward. How did the battle end? Threll's expression darkened. Not in a way anyone expected. After weeks of fighting, we finally managed to pin the resistance into a single sector of the colony. Our forces prepared for a final assault, confident that victory was within reach. But when we breached their defenses, we found nothing. They'd abandoned the colony entirely, leaving behind nothing but empty tunnels and a single message, broadcast on every frequency. You've won the moon. We've won the war. Confusion spread through the crowd, but Mara seemed to understand. What did they mean? They meant that they'd achieved their true objective, Threll said. While we were focused on the colony, the humans had been dismantling our supply lines, stealing our technology and turning our allies against us. By the time we realized what they'd done, the Skarnith offensive was over. We didn't just lose the moon, we lost the entire sector. He sighed, the sound heavy with regret. And Reyes? She disappeared after that. Some say she retired. Others say she's still out there, leading resistance cells on other worlds. But one thing is certain, the humans didn't need superior firepower to defeat us. They only needed their ingenuity, their resilience, and their ability to make every battle personal. The mess hall was deathly silent, the weight of Threll's story pressing down on everyone like a physical force. Finally, the Zoltrian broke the silence. If humans are that dangerous as enemies, why aren't they more feared? Threll stood, his massive frame casting a long shadow over the table. Because most species don't understand them. They see humans as fragile, disorganized, and unremarkable. But I've fought beside them and I've fought against them. And I can tell you this, humans don't need to be feared. They need to be respected. Because when it comes to survival, no species is more determined than them. As he walked away, the soldiers sat in stunned silence, the realization sinking in. Humans, for all their flaws, were not a species to be underestimated. And if they ever rose to prominence in the galaxy, nothing would ever be the same. The stories about humans spread far beyond the confines of the mess hall. Threll's words sparked a wave of fascination and fear across the fleet. Soldiers whispered about the terrifying ingenuity of humanity, their unpredictable tactics, and their uncanny ability to thrive in impossible circumstances. For weeks, it was all anyone could talk about. But for Threll, the stories were more than a cautionary tale, they were a reminder of the cost of war and the complexity of humanity itself. One evening, after days of avoiding the growing crowds, Threll found himself in a quiet observation deck. The expanse of stars stretched endlessly before him, their light cold and distant. He stared out at the void, his mind heavy with memories of the battles he'd fought and the humans he'd encountered. "Commander," a voice said behind him. He turned to see Mara, the Virian soldier, standing at attention. Her scales shimmered faintly in the dim light, a sign of unease. She hesitated before speaking again. "May I join you?" Threll nodded, gesturing to the seat beside him. Mara sat, her usually sharp posture relaxed as she gazed out at the stars. For a long moment neither of them spoke. "I've been thinking about what you said," Mara finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "About humans? About their resilience?" "And?" Threll asked, his tone neutral. "They scare me," she confessed. "Not because of their strength or their tactics, but because they remind me of us. Of what we used to be before the wars hardened us. Before we became what we are now." Threll's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing, waiting for her to continue. "When you spoke about Commander Reyes, I couldn't stop thinking about what drives humans," Mara said. "They fight not just for survival but for each other. For something bigger than themselves. They don't just endure suffering, they transform it into something powerful. Something unstoppable." Threll leaned back in his chair, his claws tapping rhythmically against the armrest. "You're right to be afraid," he said after a moment. "Humans are a mirror reflecting the best and worst of every species they encounter. They adapt, they learn, and they evolve. And they do it faster than anyone else." Mara frowned. "But what does that mean for the rest of us? If they're so dangerous, so capable of turning the tide of any conflict, then how can we coexist with them? How do we prevent them from becoming the galaxy's greatest threat?" Threll's gaze softened, and for the first time, his voice carried a hint of hope. "By understanding them. By working with them, not against them. Humans are not inherently evil or destructive, they're survivors. They fight because they have to, because they've been pushed to the brink so many times that they don't know how to live any other way. But given the chance, they can be the greatest allies we've ever known." Mara turned back to the stars, her expression contemplative. "Do you think they'll ever change? That they'll ever stop fighting?" Threll was silent for a long moment before answering. "Change is inevitable. But humans will never stop fighting, not entirely. It's woven into their very being, a survival instinct as old as their species. But what they fight for, that can change. And that's where we come in. If we can show them a galaxy worth protecting, a future worth building together, then maybe, just maybe, they'll fight for something other than survival." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of a comm alert. Threll's communicator buzzed with urgency, and he quickly activated it. The holographic display projected the face of a junior officer, their expression grim. "Commander Threll," the officer said. "We've intercepted a distress signal. It's from a human colony on the outskirts of the Grythane Nebula. They're under attack." Threll's jaw tightened, his mind racing. The Grythane Nebula was a lawless region, home to pirate factions and rogue warlords. A human colony there would stand little chance without assistance. "Prepare the fleet," Threll ordered. "We move out immediately." The officer nodded and disappeared from the display. Threll stood, his massive frame towering over Mara. "You're going to help them?" Mara asked, rising to her feet. "Of course," Threll said without hesitation. "Humans may be terrifying in their tenacity, but they are also capable of great loyalty. If we help them now, we prove that we are worthy of their trust. And that trust could change the future of the galaxy." Hours later, the fleet emerged from hyperspace, the swirling colors of the Grythane Nebula lighting up the darkness. The human colony came into view, its defenses battered and its surface scarred by relentless bombardment. The attackers, an armada of pirate ships, turned to face the new arrivals, their weapons ready. Threll stood on the bridge of his command ship, his voice steady as he issued orders. "Target the pirate flagship. Protect the colony at all costs." The battle that followed was fierce, but Threll's fleet quickly gained the upper hand. The pirates, unprepared for such a formidable response, began to scatter. Within hours, the colony was safe, its people emerging from the rubble to greet their alien saviors. As Threll disembarked onto the colony's surface, he was met by a human woman, tall, scarred, and unflinching. She introduced herself as Governor Lien, the leader of the colony. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice carrying the weight of exhaustion and relief. Threll inclined his head. "We couldn't stand by and do nothing. Your people have a strength that deserves to be protected." Lien's lips curled into a faint smile. "Funny. We were just telling stories about how terrifying your kind can be in a fight. I suppose that makes us even." Threll chuckled, the sound deep and resonant. "Perhaps. But let's hope that, in time, our stories will be about what we built together, not what we destroyed." As the fleet departed the Grythane Nebula, leaving the colony safe behind them, Threll felt a sense of hope he hadn't known in years. Humans were still a mystery, still a force to be reckoned with. But in their resilience and their courage, he saw the potential for something greater, a galaxy united not by fear but by understanding. And for the first time he believed that such a future might just be possible.